and thank you for purchasing the new all-metal Delta from Blue Eagle Labs. My name is Daniel, and this is Charlie. Say hi, Charlie. We'll be walking you through this series of build videos to build up the frame of your 3D printer, assemble all of the wiring, hook up the microcontrollers, program it, and get you ready for your very first 3D print on the all-metal Delta. Now, if this isn't your first 3D printer build or your first 3D printer, I suggest that you visit the forums at blueeaglelabs.com. There you'll find a lot of tips and tricks on how to optimize your printer to run it as smoothly and efficiently as possible. So once again, thank you and enjoy the videos.
Hi, this is Charlie. We're going to be building the all-metal Delta by Blue Eagle Labs. We're going to start off with the top and bottom assembly. So you will need the 2 center round brackets, the 6 short extrusions, and the hardware, M5 10mm extrusion to round center bracket screws, and the M5 T-slot nuts. Insert the screw with the head on the smooth side through the holes on the center bracket and thread on a T-slot nut. Don't tighten it up all the way, leave plenty of slack in there. You can repeat this for all of the holes on the milled portion of the center bracket. Once you have the T-nuts, the T-slot nuts all started, you can simply you can align them and simply slide them into the slot on the extrusion track. It's a little difficult to line up, but once you get it started, it slides right into place. Use a 3mm Allen wrench to tighten these up, and just make them snug for now. We're going to go back and do final positioning and tightening later. Okay, now that you have both sides assembled, you can stack them on top of one another to check the alignment. If everything lines up, you can tighten them down. If they're a hair off, just loosen the arms and kind of reposition them so they're both aligned, the top and bottom. Also make sure they're pushed all the way in with no gap on the inside. Great, so we've assembled the 2 top and bottom center bracket assemblies. Next, we're going to mount the tray and the bottom feet to the bottom center bracket. For this step, you will, in addition to the bottom bracket, you will need the center tray, the rubber feet, the M5 x 10mm rubber feet screws, and the M5 x 8mm low profile extrusion to tray screws. We'll start with the tray. All of the metal pieces in the kit, you may notice, have screws in the threaded holes. You can go ahead and remove all of these. These are put in to protect the threads during powder coating, and we aren't going to need them for this build, so you can save them for another project. Once you get all the sacrificial screws removed from the tray, we can start to assemble it to the bottom. So turn your center bracket with the center plate down and slide 2 T-slot nuts into each track. This part's going to be kind of tricky, and you might want to use an Allen key or a pointy screwdriver to position these exactly where they need to go. But we're going to take the tray and kind of center it on top. You can see there's an assortment of holes here. If you kind of look at this, creating like a snowflake pattern, if you lay the tray down, you can figure out exactly where the T-nuts need to go. It might help to get 1 or 2 nuts started, and then you can slide it into position for the other ones. Keep all the screws loose until we get them all started, and then tighten it up. It'll make it easier to position. There we go. When you get all of them in and it's fit, you can tighten them down really well. The bent part for the control panel should be facing like the 2 open legs of the Delta. Next, we can install the rubber feet onto the bottom. So flip the plate and center assembly, bottom center assembly upside down. And we will need 3 of these M5 times 10 millimeter rubber feet screws and 3 T-slot nuts. You're going to press the screw into the rubber foot. It's a little tight, so you may want to use a little force to get it started. And thread on a T-slot nut, a few turns, and you can slide it onto the bottom track of one of the short extrusions. And just tighten this up snug. You might want to reposition it later, but generally towards the end of the beam is fine. Great, now we have the completed bottom and top center bracket assemblies. Okay, next we're going to put on the motor mounts. You will need the 3 motor mount brackets. The bottom center assembly, which we just put together, the M5 times 8 millimeter low profile extrusion to motor mount screws, and 6 of the T-slot nuts. So the top of this piece has the long slot. We're going to put the screws in the bottom and thread on a T-slot nut. Just a few turns, keep it loose. Okay, once you get the T-slot nuts on the motor mount screws, we're going to slide it onto the track. The curved bent part faces the center. And just slide it on about 1 inch from the end and tighten it down snug. We're going to reposition all this stuff later. Just get it on there so it doesn't flop around. That's it, on to the next step. We can set the top and bottom assemblies aside for a little bit. We're going to work on the sides. Next, we can start on the sides. We're going to need the 3 long extrusions, the stack of L brackets, the large bag of M5 by 8 millimeter screws, and the T-slot insert. So we're just simply going to put all the screws into the plate and thread a T-slot nut onto all of them. You'll need 4 L brackets per side. I just did 4. You'll repeat this process for the 2 other sides. So you're going to slide the L bracket on and into the side extrusion using 3 of the T-slot nuts. So the bracket should be flush with the end of the extrusion. And you're going to tighten these down snug. Again, we're going to go back and align all this stuff down the road. So just make it tight so it doesn't flop around. The L brackets should all face inward. So when you put them on, make sure they line up like this. Now, it may be smart to consider where you want to mount your extruder. So I'm going to slide 2 extra T-slot nuts into the track before putting on the final L bracket. This way, when I install the extruder, I don't need to take apart any of the side rails to fish a nut in there. This is going to be the back side piece, or the Z-axis. There, this is the completed side piece. You should do this 3 times. All right, we got all 3 of the side pieces fitted with the L brackets. So we can move on. There's a few little things we want to do now that'll make it easier down the road. Namely, one is fitting the idler plate onto the inside track of the side pieces. So we're going to need the 3 idler plates, the M5 by 8 millimeter extrusion to belt idler screws, and again the T-nut T-slot nut inserts. Okay, the orientation of these idler pulley plates is the two holes go down at the bottom, and the single hole is going to be on the left side. So when you look at it, it should look like this. The heads go through from the top. We're going to put 2 of the M5 screws in there and thread on a T-slot nut a few turns onto each of them. Like this. Now we're going to slide them onto the inside of the side beam. If you went ahead and slipped some extra T-slot nuts in a track, maybe mark that one with a Sharpie and be aware of the orientation of those. If you want the extruder mounted to the left side of the beam, then that's going to depend on which way you want your idler plate rotated. But for now, if you install it upside down, we can just flip the whole arm on the other ones. So like so. You can just lock this down anywhere for the time being. Again, we're going to adjust this at a later step. We just want to position it so it's not sliding around and getting in our way, like so. Go ahead and repeat this for the other 2 side pieces, like so. Now that we have the idler plate and the L brackets installed on the side extrusions, we can go ahead and install the end stop switches. We could do this down the road, but it'll be easier now when everything's open and we won't have to fish wires through the completed frame. You're going to need 3 of the end stop switches, 3 of the long end stop cables, and the M2.5 by 10 low profile head end stop screws. Additionally, you're going to need some heat shrink, about 3/16 size, solder, soldering iron, and a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. The end stop switches mount on the bottom of the idler plate like this. But as you see, the head of the screw gets in the way of the middle terminal. That's fine because we don't need that middle terminal, so what I'm going to do is just bend this away with the needle nose pliers. Be kind of ginger with this because the plastic case is a little fragile. So you're going to want it like so. Next step then is to solder the cable to the switch. Be sure to put heat shrink on the cables so there's no chance of the terminals shorting out on the metal plates. It doesn't matter the orientation of the cable. It's basically just a make or break switch, so it doesn't matter which way they go. You can use a light or a heat gun to shrink down the heat shrink, like so. So do this 2 more times for the remaining side switches. All right, now that we have all 3 completed, it's time to mount them to the idler plates. So the way they go is with the switch down, like so. The wire is going to run up through the center space in the extrusion and over the top. And we'll need 2 screws, two of the end stop screws per switch, and they go into the threaded holes on the bottom of the idler plate. If the screws are too long and bottom out on the extrusion before the switch gets fully tight, you may need to use a washer to take up some of the slack. Like so. Be careful not to over tighten these screws, again, because the plastic housing on these switches is fairly delicate. All right, now that we have the sides assembled and the top and bottom assembly assembled, we're ready to put this thing together. You're going to need the bottom assembly plate, the top plate, and the 3 assembled side extrusions. If you already went ahead and put some extra T-slat nuts in the side of one of the side extrusions for your extruder, take note of where you want that and where it's going. You can almost put the extruder anywhere, it's up to you, but it's easier to include extra nuts now and consider it rather than trying to backtrack down the road. Okay, we don't really need any other hardware, we just need the Allen key. And we're going to carefully slide this thing together one leg at a time. Be careful that you don't pinch the cable from the end stop switches. When it slides in place, snug it up pretty tight so it doesn't shift around, but we're going to adjust everything when it's completely assembled. We just want it to stay together in one piece for now. So I'm starting with I put the top on one side, and then I'm going to mount that side onto the bottom plate. This part here is where this open end of the plate is where the screen goes. So this is going to be the front. Keep that in mind. Okay, now that we have the top and bottom held in place by one of the sides, we're just going to slip the other 2 sides on like so. It's a little easier said than done. Working with these T-slat nuts is a little different. They don't, a little difficult. They don't necessarily want to collaborate and cooperate. Oh. There, the frame's assembled. Next, we're going to need to check the frame alignment. Now, this is one of the most important steps in order to have a properly working printer. If the frame is slightly out of square, things are going to be off down the road and it's really going to be hard to calibrate it properly. So what we're going to do now, you will need a good true square, something like this. And we're going to loosen the joints and hold them against the square and make sure everything is true. So we want to make sure all the corners align properly and then there's no gaps in there either. It might be easier to do this if we loosen the idler plates and the motor brackets and slide them out of the way. So the way I'm doing this is going to be one corner at a time. I'm going to start at this top joint, then do the bottom, and then move my way around, and then double check everything after the first go through. Be sure to check the inside and the outside of the corners. All right, now that our frame's assembled, I'm going to move on to the carriages. The carriages are the little plates that ride up and down each of the side extrusions. So for that, we're going to need the 3 carriage plates, this bag of carriage wheels, bearings, the silver spacers and shims, and these M520 carriage wheel screws. I'm going to start off by pressing the bearings into the wheels. Each wheel gets 2 bearings. In between the bearing goes one of these silver shims. Please know that these are not washers and they're cut to a specific thickness. So I push the bearing in one side, and in order to keep everything aligned, I'm going to just stick one of these carriage wheel screws through the center. Like so. After the bearings are pressed through, I'm going to slide on one of the silver washers and add a tiny bit of blue thread lock. The rollers go into the threaded 5mm holes, and they are on the side opposite of this bend here, like so. All right, we have 2 of the centered wheels on the carriage plate. Before we get to the 3rd wheel that's eccentrically spaced and clamps the carriage onto the frame, I want to put the additional hardware on now because it'll be easier to work on than later. Namely, we're going to be using the ball joint heads and the M3 nylon nuts. So the ball joints go in these 2 holes that are threaded for M3s at the top of the spacer, or the carriage, and they go on the side opposite of the rollers. I'm also going to add a tiny bit of blue thread lock to these just for insurance. On the back, I'm going to put on one of these nylon hex nuts. Nylon M3 nut. Make sure that you don't over tighten these nylon insert M3 nuts. They can strip out very easily. But the plate should look like this. You can go on and put the ball joints on the other two carriage plates. Now that the ball ends are on the carriage, we can do the final wheel. We're going to use the remaining bearings and carriage wheels, and the assembly order is the same. And one of the silver washers goes in between. We're also going to be using the M25 eccentric spacer screws, the M5 eccentric spacer nut, and the M5 eccentric spacer washers. And we will need the 3 eccentric spacers. They're the ones that are hex-headed and have an off-center circle hole through the center. So just like before, the washer goes in between the 2 bearings and they press into the carriage wheel. Next goes the eccentric spacer with the hex nut side towards the bearing. I'm going to prepare this by putting a tiny bit of blue Loctite on the end of the screw. And we're going to orient the carriage wheel on the side extrusion with the ball ends at the top. And so the wheels kind of lock into that center groove on the track. Next, you're going to push, hold this assembly together with the eccentric spacer, and you're going to put it through the unthreaded large hole on the other side. Now we're going to put on a washer and then finally one of the M5 nuts to lock it in place. You can tighten this up. And lastly, we will need to rotate that eccentric spacer to move the wheel closer or farther away from the track. Mine's a little loose, so I'm going to rotate it until it starts to get snug, which is right there. And it can roll up and down, but there's no slop or wiggle in the carriage. That's it. You're going to repeat that for the next 2 carriages, and then we will move on to the next step. Now that the carriages are mounted and moving on the sides, I want to go and put the belt idler. That's going to go on this plate at the top in the remaining hole that's tapped for an M5 screw. For this, we will need the smaller bearings with the lip, the M3x20 belt to carriage screws, the M3 washers, belt idler, and more of the silver spacers and washers. So take one of the screws and the way these all stack up is screw, wide end of the bearing, tiny M3 washer, another bearing with the lip on the outside. This creates sort of a little trough for the belt to ride in. Then we're going to put another M3 washer, two of the silver washers that we used for the carriage wheel bearings, and then one of the spacers. I'm going to apply a dab of Loctite and then put this into that threaded hole on the idler plate. tighten it up, but again, don't over tighten it because you can crush the bearings. You want it to be able to roll freely, but also not be wobbly, like so. While we're at it, we can slide that idler plate all the way to the top and tighten it up. Just be careful you don't pinch the end stop switch cables. Like so. Do that for the remaining 2 idler plates. All right, we're ready to move on to the mounting the motors. Please note, depending on which kit you purchase, you may have 2 types of motors. The 90s are the traditional stepper motors with the regular resolution, and the 187s are higher res. So if you have the Smoothie Wear kit, you will want to use the 3 high res motors for each axis. The old-fashioned lower res motors are going to be used for the extruders, so you can set them aside. We will also need the 3 motor belt pulleys, the 3 M3x6 motor to holder screws, and the little Allen key that comes with the motor pulleys. We'll also need some extra M3 screws. You can use the ones that are possibly in the powder-coated plate pieces to protect the threads. But what we want to do is remove one of these tiny grub screws and replace it with the more durable Phillips or Allen key screw. This will hold up better over time. And we're going to slide that onto the motor shaft. Keep the end of the shaft in line with the end of the pulley and tighten the screw up against the flat part of the shaft. You can apply some thread lock here if you want. You can also tighten up this other grub screw as reassurance. Now I'm going to use the M3 motor mount screws to mount the motors onto the motor mounts. Right now I'm only going to use 2 in 2 diagonal corners at this point, because once we get the positioning set, I'm going to have to remove the motor to tighten the other motor mount screw. So make sure the motor mount is slightly loose on the track and can be positioned. And then put 2 screws in to hold the motor in place. Like so. Okay, now that the motors are temporarily fastened to the motor plates, I'm going to install the belts. For that, we're going to need the package of belts. We're going to need the M3x20 belt to carriage screws, and we might as well put in the manual adjust end stops onto the top of the carriage. So we'll need the M3x12 end stop screws. We're going to start by, we will also need some zip ties for this. I'm going to start by taking the 2 belt to carriage screws and putting them into the 2 remaining holes on the face of the carriage plate. Just thread them in a little bit. Actually, be careful you don't thread them too far and that they start digging into the side track. Just like so. And the M3x12 end stop manual adjust screws go into the tapped hole on the top of the carriage You can just thread these in a few turns or so. We'll adjust all this later. Like so. Next, I'm going to take a belt and 2 zip ties. I'm going to bend the belt together so the teeth are facing one another and can lock together like this. And then make a loop by putting a zip tie over it. Don't tighten it too much now. We're going to want to adjust the slack in this belt once it's all assembled. So just have it so it'll stay, like friction will hold it, but you can adjust it. Next, with the teeth on the inside, I'm going to sling it over the top idler, and back down around the motor pulley, and then back up to the screw. And again, I'm going to fold the extra belt down around so the teeth catch one another, and then throw a zip tie on to hold it. If they're really loose, you can do some adjustments now. Make it so it's a bit firm and there's not a lot of play in the belt, like so. Okay, I'm making a little loop at the end of the belt with the teeth facing together. This kind of locks it down and prevents it from slipping, and I'm using a zip tie to hold it all together. I'm not making it too tight because I want to be able to adjust this when it's in place. I'm throwing the loop onto the top screw, and with the teeth on the inside up over the pulley, idler pulley at the top, down under the motor pulley, and then back over the bottom carriage belt screw. And I'm going to fix this with another zip tie. And then I'm going to slide the belt to tension it and make it a bit more taut. You don't want to overdo it. We'll fix and finalize everything shortly, but for now that should be good. All right, go ahead and trim the tails off these zip ties. And make sure the belts are snug. We're going to be adjusting the motor positions now. So ideally, the idler is a fixed point, so where the belt is strapped to the carriage and the position of the motor are adjustable, and we want this all to be a straight line. So you can, using your eye, you can line it up pretty well, but also you'll want to check with calipers. So position the motor on the track so it's uniformly parallel to the side extrusion, and then tighten down the low profile nut that's holding it into the extruded track. This is going to lock that motor holder down. And then we can remove the motor and tighten up that last nut that's underneath. Great. Now put the motor back on. This time use all 4 of the motor mount to motor screws, because we are not going to be removing it again. You're going to want to make the belt distance the same at the top and bottom. So measure it at the top where the point is fixed, and then slide the motor into position so the distance from the vertical extrusion is identical. Really double check this, because you want this to be as parallel to the side piece as possible. When it's in place, lock down the front screw onto the track. And we can take off the motor and tighten up the screw into the extruded track underneath. There. Now that the carriage, motors, and idler are all connected, we can do the effector plate. All right, onto the effector plate. We're going to need the effector plate, the remaining ball end joints, the M3 nylon nuts for the effector and hot end, and the carbon fiber magnetic arms. These bends in the effector plate go down. They're for the fans. So the ball joints go on the outside edges and the threaded holes like so. Again, on these, I'm going to apply a little blue Loctite just to make sure it stays put. I'm going to throw a nylon M3 nut on the other side. I'm using a ratchet here, but please be careful. The ball studs are pretty fragile and can break off if you really wrench them down. And we can repeat this for the 6 remaining ball joints. Like so. Now, with all 6 ball joints installed on the effector plate, there's only one more very satisfying step, and that is to install the magnetic arms to the carriages and pop in the effector. Make sure you orient the effector plate so the arms are parallel. They do not go to the 2 center. Make sure you orient the effector plate so that the carbon fiber arms are parallel. There we go. That concludes the general construction portion of Blue Eagle Labs all-metal Delta. Tune back in for more videos covering the electronics installation and calibration.